Obadiah Quincy couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this uncomfortable in a tailored suit, standing in the grand ballroom of the Westmore Hotel with a champagne flute in his hand that he'd barely touched. As the newly appointed CEO of Vanguard Shipping, one of the largest maritime logistics companies on the East Coast, he was accustomed to commanding attention at business functions, not awkwardly scanning a room full of strangers at his college friend's engagement dinner. "There's the man of industry himself." A familiar voice boomed from behind. Obadiah turned to see Marcus, his former roommate, approaching with a wide grin. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't show and miss your engagement dinner." "Not a chance," Obadiah replied, embracing his friend with genuine warmth despite his discomfort. "Though I'm starting to think I should have asked for a +1, I barely know anyone here." Marcus laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "Well, that's about to change. Come meet Eliza's family. They're dying to meet the famous Obadiah Quincy, who once convinced our entire dorm to invest in shipping stocks." "That was just dumb luck," Obadiah muttered as Marcus guided him through the crowd toward a cluster of well-dressed guests. The introduction to Eliza's parents went smoothly enough. They were polite, if a bit intimidated by his reputation. As Marcus continued the rounds, Obadiah found himself mentally calculating how much longer he needed to stay to fulfill his social obligation. The shipping industry never slept, and a stack of contracts awaited his review back at the penthouse. "Aunt Claire, where did you put the—" A breathless voice cut through his thoughts as someone bumped into his arm, splashing champagne onto his sleeve. "Oh, I'm so sorry." The woman's eyes widened in horror as she surveyed the damage. "I wasn't looking where I was going." Obadiah opened his mouth to offer a practiced dismissal when he actually looked at her, really looked at her. Warm brown eyes framed by loose auburn curls, a splash of freckles across her nose that somehow complemented the emerald green dress she wore. "It's just champagne," he heard himself say, his voice softer than intended. "Let me at least help clean it up," she insisted, already reaching for a napkin from a nearby table. "I'm Ruby, by the way, Ruby Lawson, Eliza's cousin and apparently the clumsiest bridesmaid in history." "Obadiah Quincy," he replied, watching as she dabbed at his sleeve with surprising gentleness. "Marcus's friend from college," she finished, glancing up with a small smile. "I know, Eliza's been talking about you for weeks. The shipping tycoon who never has time for anything but work." Her words, not mine. Obadiah felt an unexpected flush of embarrassment, not entirely unfair. "Well, Mr. Quincy, since I've already assaulted your suit, perhaps I could make it up to you by introducing you to some people who won't talk about cargo ships or quarterly profits." Something in her teasing tone and the light dancing in her eyes made Obadiah forget all about the contracts waiting at home. "Lead the way, Miss Lawson." The remainder of the evening passed in a blur as Ruby introduced him to various relatives and friends. Unlike the usual stiff conversations he endured at social functions, Obadiah found himself genuinely enjoying the easy flow of conversation. Ruby had a knack for storytelling, and her animated descriptions of her work as a museum curator had him laughing more than he had in months. "So there I was," she continued, gesturing with her dessert fork, "standing in front of a room full of board members when the fire alarm goes off. And what does the prehistoric amber exhibit do when the sprinklers activate? It starts to melt." "You're joking," Obadiah said, grinning. "I wish." $2 million in amber specimens, and I'm watching them dissolve while wearing a cocktail dress and heels. She shook her head ruefully. "Turns out it was just a false alarm, but I still have nightmares about explaining that to the insurance company." "I can imagine." "Shipping has its disasters, but at least containers don't melt." "No, they just fall overboard and sink to the bottom of the ocean," she countered with a raised eyebrow. "Touché." He lifted his glass in acknowledgement, surprised by how comfortable he felt. There was something refreshingly direct about Ruby, no pretense, no careful calculation that he so often encountered in his business world. As the evening wound down, Obadiah found himself reluctant to leave. When Marcus announced that a group was heading to the hotel bar for one last drink, he immediately agreed to join them, something the old Obadiah would never have done with early meetings the next day. In the more intimate setting of the bar, Ruby settled beside him on a leather couch, her shoulder occasionally brushing against his as she leaned in to hear someone's story over the ambient music. "So, Ruby," he began during a lull in the conversation, "how did you get into museum work?" "I've always been fascinated by the stories objects tell," she replied, turning toward him. "I majored in anthropology, thinking I'd do fieldwork, but discovered I loved curating more than digging. There's something magical about creating an experience that helps people connect with history." Her eyes lit up as she spoke, her passion evident. "What about you? Always wanted to rule shipping lanes," Obadiah laughed. "Hardly. I was pre-law until my father got sick my junior year. The family business was struggling, so I switched to business and economics. Took over after graduation when he couldn't manage anymore." "That couldn't have been easy," she said softly. "It wasn't, but it was necessary." He rarely discussed this with anyone. "The company supported hundreds of families. I couldn't let it fail. And now it supports thousands," he said, surprising himself with the lack of pride in his voice. "But sometimes I wonder if you missed out on something else," she finished when he trailed off. Their eyes met, and Obadiah felt an unexpected connection, as if she had glimpsed something in him that he usually kept carefully hidden. The moment was broken when Marcus called for a toast to the happy couple. By the time the group dispersed, it was well after midnight. As they gathered their things, Obadiah found himself searching for a reason to see Ruby again. "I'm in town until Sunday," she mentioned as they waited for their respective rides outside the hotel, helping Eliza with some wedding details. "There's an exhibition opening at the Metropolitan Museum tomorrow," he heard himself say. "Pre-Columbian artifacts might be interesting for a curator." Ruby's smile was warm in the cool night air. "Are you asking me on a date, Mr. Shipping Tycoon?" "I believe I am, Miss Museum Curator." "Interested? I'd love to, but fair warning, I'll have opinions about their display techniques." "I'm counting on it." As his driver pulled up, Obadiah exchanged numbers with Ruby, feeling lighter than he had in years. Only as he settled into the backseat of his luxury sedan did he realize he'd completely forgotten about those urgent contracts. The next morning, Obadiah surprised his assistant by clearing his afternoon schedule, something he hadn't done for a non-emergency in years. Caroline stared at him as if he'd grown a second head when he mentioned personal plans. "You're taking the afternoon off, voluntarily," she repeated, adjusting her glasses as if they might be malfunctioning. "Is that so hard to believe?" he asked, skimming through emails at his standing desk. "The last time you took personal time was for your appendectomy, and you were back on Zoom calls within 24 hours, Caroline replied dryly. "The board meeting with Asian partners can be rescheduled for tomorrow morning. They'll understand." He glanced up. "I'm meeting someone." Caroline's eyebrows shot up, but she wisely limited her response to, "I'll make the arrangements." At precisely 1 o'clock, Obadiah stood on the museum steps, scanning the crowd for Ruby. He'd chosen a more casual look than his usual business attire, dark jeans and a navy blazer, and found himself oddly nervous about the choice. Punctual. "I should have expected that from a CEO, came Ruby's voice from behind him. Obadiah turned to find her approaching, windblown and slightly breathless. She wore a simple sundress with a light cardigan, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail that highlighted her features. "Professional habit," he admitted. "You look lovely." "Thanks." "I nearly got flattened by a taxi rushing to get here on time, so I'm glad the near-death experience was worth it." The exhibition was more engaging than Obadiah had anticipated, largely due to Ruby's commentary. She moved through the displays with practiced ease, offering insights about techniques and historical context that brought the artifacts to life. He found himself fascinated not just by the information, but by her enthusiasm, the way her eyes lit up when explaining the significance of a particular piece, her animated gestures as she described ancient civilizations. "I'm boring you," she said suddenly, catching his thoughtful gaze. "Not at all," he replied honestly. "I'm just impressed you really love what you do." "Is that so unusual in my world? Sometimes people love success, power, recognition. Genuine passion for the work itself is rarer." Ruby tilted her head, studying him. "And what about you? Do you love what you do?" The question caught him off guard. "I'm good at it," he said after a moment. "The company has quadrupled in size since I took over. We've expanded into new markets, weathered economic downturns." "That's not what I asked." Obadiah ran a hand through his hair, unexpectedly uncomfortable. "I used to, when every day brought new challenges, when I was fighting to save my father's legacy. Now," he shrugged, "it's more about responsibility than passion." Ruby nodded, not offering platitudes or advice, just acceptance of his honesty. Something about that silent understanding made Obadiah want to share more. As they wandered through the remaining exhibits, their conversation flowed from work to family, childhood memories to future dreams. By the time they emerged from the museum, the afternoon sun was dipping low in the sky. "Hungry?" Obadiah asked, reluctant to end their time together. "Starving," Ruby admitted. "Museum air always makes me ravenous." "I know a place nearby, small Italian restaurant, family-owned. Best gnocchi in the city." The restaurant was indeed small, a cozy establishment with only a dozen tables, warm lighting, and the rich aroma of garlic and herbs. The owner greeted Obadiah by name, leading them to a corner table with a window view of the tree-lined street. "You come here often?" Ruby asked after they'd ordered. "My office is just a few blocks away. I discovered it by accident during a rare lunch break about 5 years ago." He smiled, pouring her a glass of the Chianti they'd selected. "Antonio, the owner, doesn't let me take business calls inside. Says it ruins the digestion." Ruby laughed. "I like him already. He reminds me of my grandfather, no nonsense, deeply opinionated about food." "Tell me about your family," Ruby said, leaning forward, "besides the business legacy part." Over pasta and wine, Obadiah found himself sharing stories. He rarely discussed his mother's passion for classical music, his grandfather's habit of telling outrageous tall tales, summers spent on his uncle's farm learning to drive tractors before he could legally drive cars. In turn, Ruby told him about growing up in a small Connecticut town, her parents' bookstore that barely broke even but was the heart of the community, her own childhood fascination with historical artifacts that began with finding arrowheads in the creek behind their house. "So that's how you became a curator," he remarked, "following a childhood passion." "More like stubbornness," she admitted with a smile. "My parents hoped I'd take over the bookstore. My older sister is an accountant in Boston, the practical one. I was determined to prove that studying old things could be a viable career." "And you did." "I got lucky. Found a mentor in graduate school who believed in me, helped me navigate the very political museum world." She twirled the last of her pasta thoughtfully. "Though I admit, I still help my parents with their bookkeeping. The store is barely hanging on with all the online competition." Something in her expression, a flicker of worry quickly masked, caught Obadiah's attention. "That must be difficult," he said carefully. "Family businesses often struggle in changing markets." "They'll be fine," Ruby replied, her tone just a touch too bright. "They're diversifying, hosting events, building community partnerships." Before Obadiah could respond, Antonio appeared with dessert tiramisu he insisted they must try, refusing to accept any demurral. The moment passed, but Obadiah filed away the concern he'd glimpsed, understanding all too well the weight of family obligations. As they lingered over coffee, the conversation turned to the upcoming wedding. "So, will you bring a date?" Ruby asked, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "To the wedding? I hadn't planned to. My plus one would likely be my assistant, and she deserves time off from managing my schedule." "Poor Caroline," Ruby teased, surprising him with her recall of his assistant's name from an earlier story. Always on duty. She's exceptional at her job, probably knows me better than anyone. He paused, then added more softly, "That's a bit pathetic, isn't it?" "Dedicated," Ruby countered. "Though perhaps a bit unbalanced." "Diplomatic answer." "Museum politics," she replied with a wink. "We're trained to tell hard truths gently." The evening extended well beyond dinner as they decided to walk along the High Line, the elevated park offering views of the city lights coming alive as dusk settled. Their conversation continued, punctuated by comfortable silences and the occasional brush of hands that sent an unexpected current through Obadiah. "Can I see you again before you leave?" he asked as they reached the end of their walk, the question more vulnerable than any business proposition he'd ever made. Ruby's smile was warm in the glow of the park lights. "I'd like that. Tomorrow? I'm free after brunch with Eliza." "Tomorrow," he agreed, feeling like a college student again rather than a 32-year-old CEO. When he dropped her off at Eliza's apartment later that evening, the brief kiss they shared on the doorstep left him more exhilarated than closing his biggest acquisition deal. The following days passed in a whirlwind as Obadiah found himself rearranging his typically rigid schedule to spend time with Ruby. They explored the city together, not the Manhattan of business lunches and corporate events he was accustomed to, but Ruby's New York of hidden museums, historic neighborhoods, and tucked-away cafes where locals gathered. What had begun as casual attraction deepened with each conversation. Ruby challenged him in ways he wasn't accustomed to, questioning his assumptions about success and fulfillment without judgment. In turn, he found himself drawn to her passionate engagement with the world, her ability to find meaning and beauty in history's overlooked details. On Friday evening, their last night before Ruby was due to return to Boston, Obadiah invited her to his penthouse for dinner, something he'd never done with a woman he was dating. As the elevator ascended to the top floor, Ruby raised an eyebrow. "Having your chef prepare us something special." "Actually," he replied, feeling uncharacteristically self-conscious, "I'm cooking myself." The surprise on her face was worth any potential culinary disaster. "You cook? Don't sound so shocked," he said as they stepped into the apartment. "My mother insisted all her children learn. Said it was a basic life skill no one should outsource entirely." Ruby walked into the open-concept living space, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows with their panoramic view of the city. Unlike the sterile luxury she might have expected, the apartment held personal touches, framed vintage maps, well-worn books lining built-in shelves, a baby grand piano in the corner. "You play?" she asked, running her fingers lightly over the polished wood. "Badly," he admitted, leading her to the kitchen where ingredients were already arranged on the counter. Another maternal insistence. 12 years of lessons and I can barely manage choppin' without mistakes." "Still impressive," Ruby said, settling onto a bar stool at the kitchen island. "What are we making, he asked, raising an eyebrow. "You didn't think I was just going to watch, did you? Hand me an apron." What might have been an elegant meal preparation turned into something far more enjoyable as they worked side by side, Ruby playfully critiquing his knife skills while he teased her about her inability to follow a recipe without improvisations. By the time they sat down to eat, both were slightly flour-dusted and laughing. "This is definitely not how I pictured your life," Ruby admitted as they enjoyed the pasta they'd created together. The mighty Obadiah Quincy making a mess in the kitchen, disappointed. He asked lightly, though something in him waited for her answer with unexpected intensity. "The opposite," she replied, her expression softening. "It's nice to see there's more to you than boardrooms and business deals." "There hasn't been for a long time," he said quietly, the admission easier in the warm glow of candlelight. "Work became everything after my father died. It was simpler that way, clearer. And now," Obadiah met her gaze across the table, "now I'm wondering what I've been missing." After dinner, They moved to the couch with glasses of wine, the city lights twinkling below them. What began as conversation gave way to more intimate connection as Obadiah found himself drawing Ruby closer, their kisses deepening with an intensity that surprised them both. "Stay," he whispered against her hair later as they sat wrapped together, her head resting on his shoulder. "I should go," she said, though she made no move to leave. "Early flight tomorrow. I'll drive you to the airport." His fingers traced patterns on her arm. "Just stay tonight." The vulnerability in his voice surprised even him. Ruby pulled back slightly to look at him, her expression questioning. "I'm not in the habit of asking women to stay the night, Ruby," he said quietly. "This isn't casual for me." Her smile was both tender and teasing. "Is anything casual for Obadiah Quincy? Not when it matters." The confession hung between them, weighted with meaning. Ruby leaned forward, pressing her lips to his in answer. Morning came too quickly. Sunshine streaming through the windows Obadiah had forgotten to close the night before. Ruby looked impossibly beautiful with her hair tousled against his pillows, her freckles more pronounced in the natural light. "You're staring," she murmured without opening her eyes. "Hard not to," he replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The drive to the airport was quieter than their previous days together, reality intruding as Ruby's departure loomed. At the terminal, Obadiah pulled her close, suddenly reluctant to let her go. "When can you come back to New York?" he asked. "Or I could come to Boston next weekend." Ruby hesitated, her expression clouding. "Obadiah, we need to talk about this, about us." Something in her tone made his chest tighten. "That doesn't sound promising." "It's not that I don't feel something for you," she said quickly. "These past days have been amazing, but you're here, I'm there." "Your life is." She gestured vaguely, encompassing his wealth, his position. "My life is what? Too complicated, too busy," he frowned. "Those are problems with solutions, Ruby." "It's not just that. My parents' bookstore, the situation's worse than I let on. I've been using most of my salary to keep it afloat. I'm considering moving back to Connecticut to help run it. The museum has already approved a partial leave of absence." The revelation surprised him. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it's not exactly glamorous, is it?" "Abandoning a career I've worked for to save a failing bookstore in a small town." She shook her head. "Your world is global shipping and penthouse apartments. Mine is becoming overdue notices and inventory management for a store that most people think should just close already." "That's not fair," Obadiah said firmly, "to either of us. I'm not some caricature of a tycoon, and you know it." "No, you're not," she admitted. "But this is still complicated. Long distance is hard enough without adding all this." Obadiah took her hands in his expression serious. "Ruby, do you know what I thought about yesterday, sitting in a meeting with investors from Singapore?" She shook her head. "I thought about how much you'd love the antique maps in their corporate headquarters, how you'd probably know the history of each one, the stories behind them." He squeezed her hands. "For the first time in years, I wasn't just thinking about the next deal or quarterly projections. I was thinking about sharing something with someone who matters to me." Ruby's eyes softened, but uncertainty remained. "It's been less than a week." "I know. I'm not saying I have all the answers, but I am saying I want to find them together." He took a deep breath. "Let me help with the bookstore." Her expression immediately closed. "I'm not looking for a financial rescue, Obadiah." "That's not what I meant," he said quickly. "Listen, Vanguard has a foundation. We support small businesses, especially those with cultural significance. Independent bookstores definitely qualify." "So you'd what, give my parents a grant?" She pulled her hands away, shaking her head. "That's exactly the kind of complication I'm talking about." "No, not a grant. Consultation. Business development support. The foundation helps with modernization, marketing strategies, community engagement programs." He paused, seeing her skepticism. "It's what we do, Ruby, not as charity but as investment in communities where we operate." "And you just happen to operate in my parents' small Connecticut town." "We operate in every major port along the East Coast, which means we have a vested interest in the economic health of the entire region." He smiled slightly. But yes, I'd take a particular interest in this case. Ruby studied him for a long moment. You're serious about this? About the foundation support? Yes, about us, absolutely. He stepped closer. I'm not letting you walk away because of logistics, Ruby, not when we've barely started. The final boarding call for her flight echoed through the terminal. Ruby glanced at the gate, then back at Obadiah. I need to go, she said. I know. He kept his expression neutral, trying to hide his disappointment. Call me when you land. To his surprise, Ruby laughed, a genuine, warm sound that lightened the tension between them. You really don't give up, do you? Not on things that matter. She rose on tiptoes to kiss him briefly. I'll call you, and maybe we can talk about that foundation thing, for the bookstore, not for us. Fair enough. As she walked toward the gate, she turned back one last time. For the record, Obadiah Quincy, I'm not giving up either, just being practical. Her smile stayed with him long after her plane had departed. 3 months later, the Lawson family bookstore hosted a grand reopening in its newly renovated space. The old Victorian building had been lovingly restored, with modern amenities carefully integrated to preserve its historic character. A new cafe area featured local art and comfortable seating, while upgraded technology made inventory management and online sales seamless. Ruby stood at the entrance, greeting community members who streamed in for the celebration. The bookstore had been part of the town's fabric for over 40 years, and its revitalization had become a point of local pride. What few people realized was that the Vanguard Foundation's support had come with no publicity requirements, something Ruby had insisted upon, and Obadiah had immediately agreed to. Your parents look happy, Obadiah said, appearing at her side with 2 cups of coffee from the new cafe counter. They are. Dad's already planning author events for the summer and Mom's talking about expanding the children's reading program. She accepted the coffee gratefully. Thank you for all of this. I didn't do anything the foundation wouldn't have done for any qualifying business, he replied, though they both knew the personal attention he'd given the project went far beyond standard procedure. The past months had transformed their lives in ways neither had anticipated. Ruby had taken her leave of absence from the museum, but rather than a career setback, it had evolved into an opportunity. She'd started consulting for small museums and historical societies throughout New England, work that allowed her to split her time between Boston, Connecticut, and increasingly New York. Obadiah, meanwhile, had made his own changes. He'd appointed a COO to handle daily operations at Vanguard, freeing himself to focus on strategic direction and expansion of the foundation's work. The shift had reinvigorated his passion for the business, while creating space for a personal life that now revolved increasingly around Ruby. Have I mentioned that the new apartment is only 3 blocks from here? Ruby said casually as they stepped outside for a moment of quiet amid the celebration. You might have mentioned it once or twice, he replied with a smile. Convenient for someone who splits their time between 3 states. Very convenient, especially for visitors from New York. These theoretical visitors, would they be welcome frequently? Ruby pretended to consider this. I think I could accommodate weekly visits, perhaps more during holidays. Obadiah pulled her closer, his expression growing more serious. What about a more permanent arrangement? Are you asking me to move to New York? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Actually, I was thinking of something else. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. I was thinking we might want to consider a joint residence. Something halfway between here and the city, perhaps. Ruby's eyes widened as he opened the box to reveal a vintage sapphire ring surrounded by small diamonds. Obadiah. I found it at an estate sale last month. The dealer said it dates back to the 1920s, thought you'd appreciate the historical significance. His usual confidence wavered slightly. If it's too soon, it's not too soon, she interrupted, her eyes shining. It's perfect timing. When he slipped the ring onto her finger, it fit as if it had been made for her, a piece of history finding its rightful place, much like they had found each other. 6 months later, as spring blossoms covered the grounds of the country estate they'd purchased together, Obadiah stood beside Marcus at yet another engagement party. This time, however, he was the groom-to-be, watching as Ruby moved through the crowd of their combined friends and family. "I still can't believe it," Marcus said, shaking his head. "When I invited you to my engagement dinner, I never thought you'd end up falling for Eliza's cousin." "That makes two of us," Obadiah replied, unable to take his eyes off Ruby as she laughed with his mother. "Best dinner invitation I ever accepted." As if sensing his gaze, Ruby looked up, her smile widening as their eyes met across the room. In that moment, Obadiah knew with absolute certainty that all his success, all his wealth, meant nothing compared to the love they'd found in each other, a love that had begun with a spilled glass of champagne and grown into the greatest treasure of his life.